back to the Dungeon Masters block, the place where we come to talk about the most important person in the game, the Dungeon Master. I am one of your hosts, DM Chris.
And I'm DM Mitch.
And I'm DM Neal, a.k.a. Jote Maniac. We did it.
And the gang's all here.
We passed our skill challenge.
Yeah. Oh, did we? I mean,
I don't. Oh, no,
we can
I
talk
don't
about that.
We came ready to help each other out for the skill challenge of this episode. Because we were talking about skill challenges.
It was a very low skill challenge success rate that we needed to hit. So I think we rolled 3 right in a row.
Yeah, but it's also us, so we need all of our help to join.
One failure, and it was over.
It was over. So we almost had that with Neal pre-recording, so, we're good. But if you haven't figured it out yet, we are talking about skill challenges, which is different than skill checks. We had a long conversation about this off-air beforehand. They involve skill checks, but it is a skill challenge, and we will talk all about what those are, what the distinctions are, and how you might be able to include those things in your campaign when we get to the meat. Which we have nothing else, so we might as well get to the meat, right, boys?
Let's do it.
Let's head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
The flat meat's back on the menu, boys!
All right, so like we said at the beginning, we are talking about skill challenges today. Skill challenges is a game mechanic, if you are unfamiliar with the term, that it came out of 4th edition. It was a pretty prominent feature in 4th edition, and there have been a number of people who have taken the idea of skill challenges and created a 5th edition model for it. You can go online and find plenty of those. Really, the idea of skill challenges is easy to take in really any edition of Dungeons and Dragons. But does somebody want to explain kind of the big question here? Chris, you said it's not skill checks. It's something a little bit different. But somebody want to explain what exactly is a skill challenge? What does it look like for a DM to run a skill challenge for his players?
Well, I think you brought it up the best way is that it works in every edition of D&D, because I think at its heart it's always been a part of D&D. It still is. It's just with how well codified everything was for 4th edition that it just had really strict rules around it for that edition. But basically it's your players versus the environment rather than your players versus direct NPCs. We roll initiative. I attack, you attack. Someone eventually dies. Gold falls from the skies. It's great. But the idea that in an old school dungeon, let's say we're playing 1st edition D&D, the idea of a skill challenge still exists because I need to, search down this hallway. I need to investigate the door. I'm going to pick the lock on the door. Those sorts of scenarios always existed. But in 4th edition, again, it was codified to the degree of you need X number of successes before reaching Y number of failures to complete the skill challenge.
Yeah, I think one of the most helpful parts about a skill challenge is, like you said, Neal, I think most DMs are doing some sort of a skill challenge regularly in their games. But for those who aren't coming from 4th edition and having played that and familiar with skill challenges, they might just not be thinking about it in that way. I think the idea, the concept of a skill challenge, one of the great benefits of it is when you are planning a dungeon crawl or a situation that isn't combat, but it's going to require some skills to get through. For me, in my mind, thinking about it as a skill challenge is going to help me to plan for it better, to make it a little bit more exciting, suspenseful than if I'm just in the situation asking for one single skill check or two, or just not thinking about it besides just a couple skill checks. I think a skill challenge can help me to plan better to make it more exciting.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I think it does allow us as DMs to plan a little bit better, have things more thought out, and have them be pretty engaging. I think, because we've had time to think them through. Obviously, nothing against improving things. I have improved many skill challenges in my day. But yeah, I was thinking about there are so many reasons to use them, and if you don't use them, that's fine. But I think they really do allow you to think through them, and in the thinking through process, it allows you to help your players shine by giving specific skill checks to either somebody who maybe isn't super into role playing necessarily their character, but really loves rolling dice, right? Like it can give them a really fun opportunity to display their character's ability by having to get a certain number of skill checks within the challenge right to say like, yeah, my rogue is super awesome because they can do this, but I'm not going to role play my character a whole lot. So I think it allows for different styles of play for players. That's really fun. I was thinking about this as you were talking, Mitch. I said, and the note that I wrote down is like, I think they can help with speed of play sometimes, because sometimes like really long dungeons can be a slog to get through, or situations where it's like, yeah, I did not want to spend an hour on all of these interactions that happened. And so you could say at the beginning, for the speed of play, we're going to do some skill challenges in this social situation or whatever. Especially like, I think if your players are not good at role playing or don't want to role play, like if there are social situations where they go and it's like, okay, you're trying to peruse a room and gather information. Well, what we're going to do is you need to get 4 successful charisma, whatever performance checks or whatever you need. And then I'll give you the information. And based on how many they get in a row, you might give different bits of information along the way, instead of saying, well, now we have to sit here for 45 minutes and have this really awkward time at this social gathering that my players don't want to do, or me as a DM is not good at role playing or whatever. It can help in those situations, I think, too, to still give your players the ability to get the information or solve the puzzles they need without taking up exorbitant amounts of time to get those things done.
I think it can help the players shine. I think we talk about this so much on the show, but as a DM, knowing your players, right? And that goes with the way that they play, their strengths, their weaknesses. And like, as we're talking about this, I know that there are players I've had at my table that they have a character that they are very skilled at certain things, but maybe it's just from simply forgetting that that's something they can do. That's a skill that they're really gifted in. They rarely sometimes get a chance to use it. If you have a player like that or players like that at your table, a skill challenge can give your players a chance, their characters to shine, bringing certain skills to the forefront of a challenge, of a situation, in which they aren't just walking away from the table for the 4th time going, oh man, I've never used that skill, even though that I have that skill. It'd probably be great if I got a chance to use that skill. I think it'd be a great thing to create a skill challenge that can let your players shine with their skills that they have built up.
Yeah, the other thing I think of, and this happens on the podcast regularly, where I feel like our discussions make me think something profound, but then I immediately double think of like, this might not be profound at all. I'm still inevitably going to say it. But one of the things that made me think was often there's a negative connotation about, air quote, the story being on rails. And to a degree, depending on how strict your skill challenge is, it can certainly feel like it is on rails because it is very strict of which skills can be used, how many successes and how many failures. But at the same time, like one of the ways that I don't feel like I've ever looked at that idea from the other side was until now, there's something very nice about those rails for a DM who is very early in their career. Because the idea that a skill challenge it just has those really set rules could make someone who is new to the table very comfortable, because now I can really think about, okay, Mitch, you're going to use athletics. I understand how I feel like that can interact with my skill challenge. And then as time goes on, if you were to switch it, and I know, Chris, you were mentioning this before, like that switch between athletics and acrobatics is probably one of the most commonly asked questions at the table, inevitably, because one person is really strong and one person is really dexterous. And inevitably one will ask to do the other. Sure, that works long term, but in that early stages, I think a skill challenge can really help to set a DM up for long-term success with more imaginative scenarios later. But early...
Well, to play off of that, too, like I think if you are an experienced DM with completely new players, Like, it might not be for the DM's benefit, but it might actually be for the player's benefit, because there have been a number of times where I've come to the table with people who are new where it's like, oh, I don't know what I can do in this situation. Like, I have zero idea what's going to happen here. It's like, it could be a very basic way to say, okay, let's, in the first few sessions where there's not like, you're not really getting into the depths of the story yet necessarily, you might have the ability to say, we're going to do a lot of these skill challenges for each player. Like, I'm going to create specific scenarios that are going to need a specific player to do a skill challenge that may involve multiple different of their skills. And I'm going to be very straightforward about that so they can understand when to use that and how to use that and what times would be appropriate to use that in the future, because they now have an example situation of when they used that skill in the past. So I think it could be really good for a seasoned DM. Oftentimes we forget that as we go, like, oh, I'll explain things as they figure it out along the way. And it's like, well, no, sometimes we need to actually help them along the way, because our helping people along the way is like, well, they know how the sandbox stuff works. When in reality, it's like, no, maybe we actually have to give them the shovel and teach them how to dig sand and put it into the, sand castle a little bit.
We always got that one player who's eating sand.
That's a good point though, Chris. I think for a DM with new players, it can be a great way to teach them even just what their skills are. Like, what is the difference between acrobatics and athletics? You create a challenge that has those two, and the way that you describe the successes and failures and what the characters are doing with those skills can teach the differences, can teach what situations they might in the future outside of a skill challenge use those skills for. I think it could be definitely a place where you teach. Also, as a DM that's been DMing for a while now, a big thing that keeps coming to my mind is when I'm creating dungeons, like, it's always kind of one of the slowest processes for a DM for me is creating a new dungeon for characters to go in and go through. And it's like, I can just think of myself drawing the next room and then just sitting there for 5 minutes going, okay, what's in this room, right? Like, is it just another combat? Is it like a treasure room? Is it a puzzle room? I appreciate having the concept now that I can go, this room is a skill challenge room. There's going to be, the bridge is going to start falling, and there's going to be 3 successes or 3 failures, 3 things that happen for them to get through this dungeon room based on it being a skill challenge. I love the idea of having a skill challenge be a new type of room that you can put into your dungeon format that can help make your dungeon more dynamic and exciting and suspenseful.
Well, the other thing is like having those really, again, we're focusing really on like the really hard rules about the skill challenge, because I think soon enough we're going to talk about a lot of different rules that results may vary. But I think the other thing is having really set success, really set failure. And that also is helpful because now everyone knows what's going on. Every player knows what success means. Every player knows what failure means, and the DM can operate under that as well. Because then from there, you could shift to what is a partial success, what is a partial failure, and the thing I think of is like we keep saying success and failure, but like failure doesn't have to be big. Success doesn't have to be big with these either. It's not like either you win or you die. I mean, that's often how combat feels. So I think that kind of comes over to the idea of a skill challenge, but it just dawned on me like none of that's true. Like, failure could be an inconvenience at most if that's how you wanted to play it.
Yeah, like you have to unlock a door and it takes 3 successes to unlock the door, and if you fail 3 times, then everything breaks inside the lock and you can't get in. Like, it's not like all of a sudden, no, the door's going to explode and you die. Like, it's not. I mean, maybe that's the challenge, but then
it's a mimic.
Yeah, right. But yeah, the challenge doesn't have to be like, the failure doesn't have to be catastrophic.
That sounds like one of the most exciting skill challenges ever. All right, guys, you got to open this door.
It seems
2 failures, you're fine. 3 failures, it's a mimic and you die. A terrible
It changed
death.
the reality of what the door was. Okay, yeah, let's talk about the mechanics, because I think it's a weird thing for us to say on the show. Let's talk about the mechanics, right? But I think us talking about basically with the mechanics, how would we run a skill challenge? What are different ways that we could do it? there's a whole lot of things that we want to talk about with that. So let's bring it back to what a skill challenge is. It's this idea that you have a certain a number of successes with different types of skills that you need to succeed on, your players need to pass before they reach a certain number of failures. It seems like the standard rule is that you can have you pick the X number of successes, but it seems the standard rule is it's 3 failures. Always 3 failures leads to the situation. You do not succeed, you fail. So once you reach 3, you're done. Of course, as a DM, that's up to your discretion, but at least in my mind, I think that's a pretty good rule, and it can add on to the difficulty when you're just adding different successes. 3 successes, 3 failures, pretty normal. 5 successes, 3 failures, getting harder. 10 successes, 3 failures, this is going to be a pretty difficult challenge to succeed in. I guess one of the first questions I want to ask you guys is, thinking about a skill challenge, is it helpful to not just run skill challenges as a DM, but one, would you kind of want to bring your players in on the knowledge of what a skill challenge is, that this is a mechanic that you would now be using, and then when you do a skill challenge, would you want to tell your players, we're looking for 7 successes versus 3 failures? Or would you say to them, this is a skill challenge that's going on right now. I'm not telling you how many successes you need, but 3 failures and you're done.
I think it depends on the situation for me. So I think it goes back to like the speed of play situation. Like if I am clearly trying to speed up the play to get to something meaningful, I would probably say, hey, we're going to do a series of skill checks, we're going to do a skill challenge here. Like if we are perusing the room for information, this is a room full of drunken sailors or whatever. It might be an easy situation because they're all drunk. They're, filled. They've thrown, everything out the window and there's an open book about everything, right? You need 3 successes, 3 failures, like super easy. Now, along the way, what I would say, if there's an NPC that you want somebody to specifically interact with, you can slow the speed of play down to say like, well, you come up to, the captain of the deceitful compass or something like that, who is like this, you've heard of this person before. And that one you could have a little bit more interaction with. But in the end, you still have a skill check to see like how that all plays out. So I think that for me, speed of play would be probably the biggest reason why I would tell people. But I think there's a lot of ways to like not let it be known that there is a skill challenge. Like if I walked into a dungeon and there was a room where you see a spiral staircase going down, but there's a grate over top of it. And there's 3 different things around the room that you have to do in order to open the grate there. I might not say it's a skill challenge because they can clearly see there's 3 things that they have to do. But if they try it and they all fail, like they fail one of the times, it counts as a failure, And in my mind, after 3, there's a bigger trap that happens. The ceiling starts to close on them or whatever as the failure for not making it through that skill challenge. So I guess it just depends for me, what's the objective here? Do I want to speed up play, get them the information they need, or is it actually going to create for a stressful, fun environment for their players to go forward?
Yeah, I like the idea of both. I think early on, I think especially with newer people on either side of the screen, I think having it all out there is probably the better way to go. I mean, long term, in a lot of ways, if you think about that room, then just certain things need to have happened to that room. Not necessarily that your players needed to have done something specific, but though, because you're talking about these 3 things, like those 3 things need to happen to the room. And once they do, they succeed, but also seeing what failure looks like. So I too would probably keep that a little bit more hidden, but then also just be tracking success and failure on the side. But I also think a lot of travel, using skill challenges for travel or exploration, because those can just get either take way too much time or take way too little time, with that like dotted line that went across the map and yay. But having like a quick skill challenge to see how stressful on the party that was. And maybe each failure is a level of exhaustion, which means when they get to the town, they have to spend an extra day. And that's still even quick, but then it still shows, consequences for travel.
Or you get lost and then it takes you an extra day out in the wilderness, you know?
I think in general, I think I like the idea of actually telling the players. And I think I like the idea of like introducing skill challenges as a mechanic. I'm picturing in my mind like having set skill challenge markers that you can like place out. So rather than saying like, okay, guys, welcome to another skill challenge, just like you would, introduce combat by roll for initiative, you can place like these markers out there or these charts that are for skill challenges. So maybe you have a couple of these, and I'm just thinking of like a piece of paper. You can make it as nice as you want, right? That has like 3 check boxes for successes, 3 check boxes for failure. And maybe you can like have these tokens that you put on every time there's a success or every time there's a failure, just a visible like showing of how well or how poorly the skill challenge is going. But then of course you can like, you set out that one that's like got 10 boxes for successes and 3 boxes for failure. Like that's something that I think would, just by placing it out there, you're watching the players be like, oh boy. Because, we were talking about this before we even started the episode, but Neal, you mentioned like death saving throws. Players know how many they have to succeed and fail for. And every time I see some player rolling for death saving throws, it's suspenseful and they know. Obviously, it's up to the DM, but personally, I think that there's a way to do this and let the players know, here's what a skill challenge is. I'm putting this out there for you. Let's see how it goes.
Well, I think you could even not put it out there, but tell them that it's a skill challenge. Like you don't tell them how many successes or failures they need in the same sort of way of a death saving throw. If you have the players hide those and stuff, they still know what's going on. But like I do that with my players where it's like, hey, don't tell anybody whether you got a success or a failure in combat, because I want them to treat it as if like, oh, we just watched our friend go down. We either have to fight harder or we have to run to try and help them, right? You could say behind the screen, hey, this is a skill challenge and it's pretty hard, Now for you, that means 6 successes and 3 failures. But for them, it's like, we don't know how many it's going to be, until you do it enough times and then they figure out like an armor class of an enemy, like, oh, well, it's 15 here. And then you have to change the armor class on each individual enemy. So it's a little bit more, fun, but.
Well, yeah, and you brought up a good point that I had thought of before, but like there's no reason you can't have a skill challenge inside of combat.
Sure.
Like that's super classic movie trope of there's all of these enemies everywhere, every which way, but so and so has to disarm the bomb before it goes off and the city's gone. Like something to
then
that
you have
effect.
2 stressful scenarios.
Well, we've kind of
fine.
not moved into the discussion on what does failure look like, but based on their failure, it could make the combat harder or keep enemies at bay or make it easier. Chris, you were talking about using skill challenges and you talked a lot about like time, and like I think of adding a skill challenge into a combat situation that they could just completely ignore. But if they were to succeed on it, maybe they are trying to go back to the like now I kind of made fun of you with the door thing. Now I'm going to return to the door, like closing a door or a gate that stops more enemies from charging into the room. You build a skill challenge based on that, and their success or failure means the combat is easier or more difficult.
Yeah, you have the the wheel that's going to turn the portcullis down, but it's going to take you 20 or 30 seconds to do this, and one person is dedicated to that. Meanwhile, each round you have 3 more kobolds run through the door. On cue, you have 3 more, no matter what, coming in through the door.
Yeah, you failed and you've broken the lock. There's no way to unlock it. Now I have to, we go with brute strength. But now everybody on the other side of the door, and probably everyone on both sides of the door, is fully aware of what's going on. And that could be your fail.
Or in doing that, it got 3/4 of the way down. So now it's actually still helped, but they have to crawl under. So now there's only 1 coming through at a time instead of 3, So there's that element too to failure where it's like, it might not be a complete failure because you were in the process of doing something, but it still is a failure because now you still have 1 getting through every time.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing that like I'd like to talk about with failures, right? Because I don't think that you should run, and it seems that most of the internet agrees with me on this, that you should run
Just always
a skill challenge. Yeah, right.
If
If the internet agrees with me, I'm in good standing, right?
Yep.
So, but like with a skill challenge, don't look at it as just like only success or only failure. If you have 3 successes and you complete the skill challenge, yes, you succeed. But if you got a failure during your track to get there, or 2 failures getting there, it should be a success, but I think there should be a cost. So, Chris, I think that's a great example of you're thinking of a portcullis coming down or like a gate coming down. And so if you get 1 failure, well, it comes down, but it doesn't come down fully. So all the kobolds are able to get through, but hey, your success is that you stopped that armored ogre from getting through, but there's still some enemies getting through. It comes down even further, and yes, the kobolds are able to get through, but like you said, it slows the amount that they have to go slower and come through. There's a cost to the fact that you did have some failures.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, even on the flip side of that, like if you think a situation is like, hey, we're running down an alleyway to get away from this bad guy, and I just need 3 successes to get out, the same sort of thing could be true. Like it could be a windy alleyway, but along the way, you bump into a box, and what you don't tell the players is, well, actually something ripped off of your body because you failed, and now they're able to track you a little bit better, and they can eventually, like maybe a day or 2 down the road, because they know the direction you're going, they can now catch up with you.
Yep, that's a great example of a failure. Yeah, some costs to failing a skill challenge.
Even if it's just
lead
one
to death.
Yeah, it does. The mimic will find you.
So it's not combat skill challenges, but here's a question I have with when we're talking about failures. Would you guys ever use damage as a consequence to a skill challenge? Because kind of like Neal, you said, the consequences don't have to be that bad. Like death. Death is the big consequence of combat, right?
Yeah.
I think all 3 of us would say, yeah, most skill challenges, especially the social ones. Well, sometimes social ones, real failure can like execution, right? Or something. But like death is not going to be like you failed completely. Death is not going to be the typical, hopefully, end of a skill challenge failure. Is damage ever on the table for you guys as a DM? And if so, when?
For sure, I think so. I mean, you think about the scientific experiments that they did with rats to teach them the right direction to go through a tunnel, right? Not saying that
this
our
is what we
players are
want,
rats
yeah.
or mice.
Think of your players as science.
But think about like
rats.
if you're trying to do something mechanical, but it has a magical trap that can reset itself if you fail, right?
Yeah.
You need 3 challenges, but if you fail something, you get electrocuted and you take 3 points of damage, or roll a D4 worth of damage. Well, then there's a little bit of damage there each time, and you might still be able to keep going, but it's like, well, what happens when you fail 3 times? Then there's a bigger, like you've tripped it enough for a bigger shock to come through. I think you can work it in as a trap to a specific skill challenge in situations like that. So yeah, I think there could be damage. I don't think damage should always be the answer. I think we can be more creative than that, but
yeah. And for me, I think it just has to mean something, because again, if you go back to the idea that like you're during travel and you have a failure and I damage you, 5th edition, as long as you sleep, it was irrelevant. But then that's where that level of exhaustion comes in, because then that's more meaningful for that skill challenge. So I think that's my big determining factor would be, does it mean something? Are they trying to go through that dungeon where every bit of healing is something that they need and every bit of damage really matters? Then it starts to make more sense to put it in there. Yeah, so that's probably when I would do it.
What about crit successes and crit failures? What would you guys do? Would you have a rule based on nat 1s and nat 20s and skill challenges, and what would you guys do with that?
They die. No,
lots of damage. They die.
Yeah. No, I mean, but looking at a death save isn't a bad way to go. And some of the stuff I saw online where it's hard, because given how many successes you need versus how many failures you need, I would lean towards a 1 just automatically being a failure and a 20 being an automatic success, potentially being 2 successes or advantage on the next check. Or I think giving a little bit more on that side makes more sense to me, or having an inspiration that you could give to someone else, something like that. But for sure, the 1 is a fail. For sure, the 20 is a success plus.
Yeah, I think it depends on the situation for me. I think I would lean more towards no, but giving advantage or disadvantage, just because I think the situations are so different that I don't know if, for example, if it's a skill challenge that's going to involve multiple people, I like the idea of giving advantage to the next person because you did your part of it so well.
That's a good rule.
Especially if it's like a different type of challenge. So the example I have is like, if you have to do something arcane the first round, right? But you suck at strength stuff or dexterity stuff. You do yours so well that it's like, there's nothing in the way that would prevent the person from doing their physical challenge next. It makes sense to give the person advantage. I kind of also like that for other skill challenges too, because I think more so from the perspective of failures. I don't, especially if there's only 3 failures that causes a failure, you can get to that real quick, especially if you have like 7 successes to get there. Giving somebody disadvantage still sucks, but it's not like, oh crap, I now have 1 left. And this was a fairly easy challenge. Like, that doesn't seem like my character should fail at that terribly. But giving them disadvantage and then vice versa, giving them advantage on the next one is still a huge plus, but it's not swaying the scales to like the cataclysmic on the bad side or the like triumphant. The advantage is still going to mean a lot on the other side, but I think it takes away the sting, but still has a severity of like, oh, now I have disadvantage for the next one, but there's still a chance to not have it fully be 2 failures, I think is the reason I would probably do advantage and disadvantage over success and failure.
I love the advantage disadvantage. That's great. I was even thinking as you were talking about that from a like social skill challenge perspective, it makes a lot of sense that if you crit fail, you might say something that's so like insulting in that situation that, yeah, it gives that next roll, that next skill challenge opportunity a disadvantage because you've kind of got to work your way back from it. Or with a nat 20, you say something that's so well spoken, you've got that silver tongue thing going on that it sets it up to make it easier for that next person in line. That's a great mechanic.
Yeah, or it's like, hey, you've done so well, let me introduce you to somebody, as another layer to the social the social situation. Then you're having their word saying like, oh, this person's amazing. Like, I've been talking with them for the past 10 minutes. You should totally get to know this person. Thusly setting up the next player or that player to say, well, now I have this great stamp of approval going to talk to the Baron of this town or whatever. And I have advantage on the next roll.
Well, so I just want to say that, like, Chris, I think you just created my homebrew rule for failures and successes in skill challenges. I'm going to say what I was going to say in the first place, but just know, listeners, that everything I say from here is not how I'm going to be doing it, because I think Chris just made up the greatest one.
This is how I'm doing it.
But I was going to originally say, like, I would sometimes do the crit 1 is 2 failures, crit nat 20 is 2 successes. I was also thinking that a crit 1 could, rather than add 2 failures, it can add another success that needs to be another success that needs to happen before you succeed the challenge. So it's gone from a 6 success to a 7 success. And maybe that's because the failure resulted in another problem that you have to add in a different type of skill that needs to like fix that problem. Like, your failure means that you tripped off of the bridge and you're now holding on. And so the next challenge that's coming up, the next check, is your friend trying to help you back onto the bridge. But yeah, like I said, Chris's disadvantage and advantage, I think, is probably the best version of that in my mind. So that's the one I'm going to go forward and use.
You don't have to, Neal.
You do, Neal.
I hate it.
We need unity here.
Well, no, so the other, so I was watching Nerd Immersion, which is a channel on YouTube. You should check it out. It's great stuff. Also because he does the news, and it's great because then I don't have to go find the news. It's just a wonderful experience for me. One of the other things is that as 5th edition went on, and I was thinking it's Mordekainen's or Tasha's, one of the books where it adds additional uses for tool proficiencies. One of the things is if a use of a tool and a use of a skill applies to the same thing, you already gain advantage on that check, which makes those tool proficiencies a lot more viable, means a lot more, fleshes out your character in a different way, because who in this world doesn't think back to like the random thing they've done to better apply to the scenario they've currently found themselves in? Like, I have brewer's tools. Does that help me with a magic arcana check related to potions? I don't know. It could. I mean, and there's justification. So like adding that advantage and disadvantage and then like layering those things in, I think is always a really good dial to turn. Because again, it helps the players help themselves. But no, I think it's just a lot more fun to add those things because it's so tangible, especially because you're getting to roll you're either getting or having to roll multiple dice depending on advantage or disadvantage. And I think there's something really about that tactile feel of those that inspires players to go towards it.
How would you guys run who's like turns in a skill challenge? Who goes next? We were talking about this before we recorded, and Neal, you were saying that one of the easiest ways to do it is just treat it like combat in the sense of roll initiative. And so you go based off of your initiative, who takes the next skill challenge turn.
Yeah, well, I think going back to figuring out what, how strict are the rails, again, to be more helpful for either side of the screen, having just a hard initiative count, then and then because there's something also convenient about like, okay, I know I can do this and then you can do that. But the other is that everyone gets a turn per round, and so the scenario we kind of played through is like, if I'm running it, Mitch, you take your turn, Chris, you take your turn. But it just makes more sense for the next round that, Chris, you go ahead and take another turn based on whatever we're talking through that scenario. It just makes more sense. And then Mitch would have to take his turn next because you've already taken a turn that round.
Yeah.
So basically your rule would be no one can take a second turn until everyone has taken a turn that round.
Yeah. I mean, I think obviously like if you're in combat, like we talked about one of the scenarios, if you're in combat and you have a skill challenge going on, you're probably going to be in initiative order at the same time.
Yeah.
Right?
There's some ticking clock countdown like that. You can't just wait forever. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But a social situation, I might DM differently. Like I might say, listen, like I don't want a player taking the whole entire skill challenge if the other players are like, but we want to be part of this. But I've definitely been at situations at the table where I've had players who would rather have somebody else do that skill check or even be the one who's speaking the whole time. And really, skill challenges can be for a whole entire party. You could also have a skill challenge that's just for one player for a certain situation.
Well, so here's another rule that speaking of turns, here's another rule, and I'll throw it out there, and we'll see how we like it. One of the things that the Critical Hit podcast did, which is a super long running 4th edition podcast. And I think part of it is certainly the element that the podcast, when a podcast is created, there is an intent that it does need to create a certain level of entertainment value that is not necessarily required at your personal table. So that said, I still like this rule where, again, let's say we're going in order. Mitch, you do athletics. That means that Chris, you could not do athletics next. Also, Mitch, for your next turn, you could not do athletics. Basically, no character can do the same check twice in a row, and no check can happen back to back. It just stretches the mental muscles to do different things because at the end of the day, like we all know which skill we're best at, and so. I mean, maybe it's okay and maybe it's fun and narratively it can work, but there's something to be said about not having to do just an athletics check every single time.
Yeah, we need 5 successful attempts at an athletics check is not, in my mind, an interesting skill challenge. Maybe, yeah, I don't want to like say that can never happen, but for me, like, yeah, I think you'd want some diversity in the skills. And I think that if you're choosing that players can go whenever they want to as well, and not knowing what that next skill is going to be, well, you might have a player go, athletics, I've got this one, I'll do it. Well, okay, you're done for this round of the skill challenge. And then another one comes up that's an Arcana check, and they're like, dang, I'm also the best at Arcana. Well, it's okay. You can't go, though, now. So somebody else is going to have to go, and it might end up with somebody who's not good at that skill going, which is going to add pressure to the situation, which in my mind is a fun situation.
I love the idea of a social situation being like, if you all are invited to this ball, right, then everyone has to do one of the skill checks at some point. Like, you might up the difficulty or like the amount of failures. So instead of like 3, if you have 6 people in your party, like it's not automatically going to be a super hard one. You might say it takes 6 successes and 6 failures instead. So everybody's involved in it. So at least there's this one moment where like the barbarian is hanging out in the corner of this ball with no shirt on or whatever. And it's just like, somebody approaches them, they have to at least do the challenge once.
And
just
that
for the
player is just crossing their fingers for an intimidation check.
Yeah, right.
Please,
right.
please.
But you allow them to say there are 7, instead of saying a specific skill check that goes with that, you say, what is your situation in this moment that you're going to try and use? It could be intimidation, right? You could say, well, I'm going to intimidate this person into giving me information, or saying like, it might not be intimidation to intimidate them, but like they do something that's like super intimidating. Like they're talking and all of a sudden it's like, hey, I bet you can't scare that bartender over there by slamming your axe into the bar, right?
Ripping a phone
challenge
booth,
accepted. I'm going to intimidate.
Book.
Yeah, right. Challenge accepted. I'm going to do that instead of the situation of like, I'm not good at talking, like you could allow them to say, hey, this is a 6 challenge. Like this, you have to get 6 things for the number of parties. You guys can decide what you want to do here in order to get this, but it's up to you to figure out how that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Skill check to stand menacingly near table. Roll.
Or to not say anything dumb, like to be left alone. Like you could be intimidating that way,
I think one thing that we haven't talked about that is really, really important to the idea of coming up with skill challenges is, as the DM, you really want to, and this is why I think for me personally, I like the idea of planning skill challenges ahead of time rather than improvising them. Improv them, sure, but like for me, I'm going to do better planning them ahead of time with the idea that as DM, it's my job to describe narratively the successes and the failures and what they look like. Because a very boring skill challenge is, all right, roll your athletics. Great, you pass. Okay, now next up, you have to roll a nature check. Oh, you failed. Okay, next up, describe what happens when they succeed, what happens when they fail, set up it narratively what that next skill check is going to look like and why it is the type of skill that's being chosen there in that situation. I think that's really important to make this exciting.
Yeah, and you could also have them do that too at the same time.
Absolutely.
Like you guys could work together on describing what it looks like, and if they have a really cool idea of how to add to that, or, in the same way that Critical Role says when they kill somebody, like, how do you want to do this? Like you could say you succeed. So what does it look like? What does it look like to succeed? And that way you're getting your players into it too. And yeah.
That was a great element of the Edge of the Empire Star Wars role-playing game. It was based off of successes and failures, and the rules stated that the player was in charge of describing their failure or their success and how it looked like. And so maybe as DM, you're setting up the skill check of the skill challenge, and your players are describing their success and their failure and what it looks like narratively. All right. Well, we've kind of talked about the mechanics for skill challenges, why we would use them, how we would use them. Last but not least, we thought it would be nice to just come up with some scenarios, some examples of different types of scenarios that could be a skill challenge that you could use in games. So what are some situations that come to your mind for different types of skill challenges to use?
I think a chase is probably a really typical one where you're either being chased or you're chasing someone, and then because at that point your success and failure is pretty straightforward. In that either you get away or you catch the person you're after. I think that's a really good way to implement a chase is through skill challenge.
I'd much rather use a skill challenge for a chase scene than a combat situation where I'm having to go, how do I do this with this map limitations? And especially if players split up, and do I have to, if I'm using any sort of like model for scenery, do I have to move them to show that this map is moving?
Or to say,
oh
hey,
gosh, that seems like a nightmare.
You have the same movement speed, so you're both dashing and you all move at the same speed. That sounds
absolutely. A chase would be a perfect situation for a skill challenge.
I think about like dire situations. So different than a chase scene, but like there's a runaway carriage in the middle of town and somebody has to stop it, right? It may require some skill challenges in order to calm the horse down. Or if you're out at sea and your ship is in the middle of a storm and you have to right your way through it, right? Or you come up against like a treacherous whirlpool or something like that out in the waters, like moments like that it's not going to be one success clearly and you get out. It's going to require a little bit more because of the stress of the situation, because it's a dire situation, could very easily turn into a skill challenge.
Now, one of the things that I thought of was something that's certainly not dire, and that's like your character's at a festival or a carnival, and they want to engage in some like games there or some challenges that maybe lead to them, if they succeed, winning some prizes, or even just like the pride of like being the person who ran the obstacle course in that city the best. They get a medal. A skill challenge, I think, is a much more interesting form than just, all right, we're basing it off of one roll, one check. You succeed or you fail, but having this mechanic set up, I think would be really cool.
I think in a similar vein, like we had talked about the difference between like PvP and PvE, like if you're at a carnival, for example, and this can be used other places too, like a bar or whatever, but somebody has like the world or the town it's the town arm wrestling champion, right? But you might not have stats for this person because you're making it up on the spot. You could very easily turn that into a skill challenge, right? Like you don't have to, maybe it's not one that you share, but you could very easily say, you know, it's going to take them 5 successes to do this and 3 failures. And you could just have them roll the entire time and say, if they pass this, they get a success. And you describe it as like, oh, if you failed, you move back a little bit and you're failing now. And you could do it that way in case you don't have stats rolled up for the town arm wrestling champion or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Well, I also like we brought up the idea that in combat you could have a skill challenge because that's the way you're setting it up. It could also be a way to continue to engage certain players because inevitably your party has split. One side of that split has decided to start punching, and the other side is off doing something completely unrelated. But as a way to kind of engage in that same routine, you're having them do a skill challenge, because it could be as simple as they're shopping to get the best price. There's no reason I can't make that a skill challenge while the other people are in the middle of a bar fight.
Yeah.
And so, potentially using it as a way to engage in that same process, because then we're still going around the table in potentially initiative order and then calling on that person to make their next.
The moral of the story, though, never split the party.
Well, I mean, sure. That sounds great.
Well, Neal, you brought up like traveling earlier too, and I think traveling is a great time to use skill challenges and to like give your players a chance to describe success, failures, what those things look like, them hunting for food, and like those failures could end up in being a combat because maybe they're hunting for elk and well they fail so bad that they go into owlbear territory, and that ends up being a combat that you add because they fail. That's part of that failure. Another one that I thought of that I think kind of changes my mind of how fast a skill challenge could go is like a escape situation, like a prison break or something, where it could literally be the entire night is a skill challenge of a prison break, and you're role playing through all of those situations to escape and slowly adding successes or failures And that could end in either success of escaping that prison or failure, whether it's complete and total failure or, well, you succeeded, but you got 2 failures in there and you alerted guards and they're chasing you down. And you've got that scenario that, Chris, you said earlier, like you dropped something that is going to lead them to, you're being tracked down. So the next time that we get together and play, you're on the run with a bunch of the city guard on your tail.
Yeah. Your idea of the prison break brought up an idea for me that you could do a set of skill challenges within a greater skill challenge scenario.
The ultimate skill challenge.
Well, no, like if you're having an entire night of skill challenges, like a prison break or something, like you could very easily say, like, each scenario you walk into is a set of you might not get caught right there, but that is a failure against you. And every time you succeed, it might actually count as a success towards the bigger skill challenge that's going on for the night. So after 5, like, you may find a place to hide, or something like that is successful with inside of the, whatever the situation is. But you could do a set of skill challenges inside.
You have a little chart on the board for each one, and then you have a giant chart like behind you that's just looming over the players. Like, this is the big one.
This is it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. One thing that we didn't talk about that I think that for me as a DM, this would really encourage my players on is to use those inspiration tokens that they always forget are in front of them. They would probably start remembering if I do skill challenges more.
So I will circle us up with what I think is probably the best media example of skill checks versus skill challenge. And it is the very beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark. When he's going in, those are skill checks. When he's going out, it is definitely a skill challenge.
That's to not get run over by the boulder.
And that concludes our homework. Go watch that movie.
Done.
Right. Exactly.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Dungeon Masters Block. If you have thoughts on skill challenges, if you've come up with your own system, you can write us an email at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. You can also go onto your podcatcher app of choice and leave us a 5-star review. It helps us to reach other people and hopefully keep on growing that Dungeon Master community out there in the world. That's definitely one of our highest goals for the show.
And if you wanted to follow us on social media, you can always head over to Twitter and find us at DMS_block. That's at DMsBlock. Or like us on Facebook. Find us on Instagram.
The Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network, where you can also go to listen to other shows like Geek Wars, Detentions and Dragons and Daughters, and more.
Well, that's it. Well, that's all we have for this episode of the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we come together to talk about the Dungeon Master, the only person capable of playing God,
killing characters,
and lowering the ego of everyone else at the table. I'm DM Neal. Good luck.
Have a great night, everyone.
Keep on dungeon mastering. Bada boing, bada boom.
Goodbye.